Очень рада вас приветствовать в энергетическом лектории Сколково. И я очень надеюсь, что это наша инициатива по привозу лучших международных экспертов, которые смогут на таких открытых публичных лекциях делиться своим опытом и рассказывать о своем видении, что она будет расти и развиваться. Следите за нашими новостями, потому что у нас еще в июне будут очень интересные лекции. Пока подержу интригу. So now I'm switching to English because our plan is not only to introduce to you the best international experts, but also to make it like a small exercise in English so that you can keep in a good shape. And I'm really happy to present, to introduce to you the man who needs no introduction at all. And I'm sure that all of you who came here know him well and have read his books and have learned a lot. I mean, we were all studying Russian energy and international energy based on your stories and your books. And well, Teyn Gustafson. He's working at IHS Market, which used to be CIRA, for many years. He was actually one of the founders from the very beginning, and he participated. He has actually launched, I believe, to a large extent, all these Russia and Eurasian studies division, and has devoted a lot of his effort to develop this research. He's also professor at Georgetown University, lecturing to the students, new energy, and he's one of the greatest writers writing about energy. So, Teyn, I'm really happy to welcome you here at Skолково, and the floor is yours, please.
Thank you very much, Tatiana. Are we on the air? I guess we are. Okay, good. And everybody can hear? All right. Well, good afternoon, good evening. Thank you very much for coming, so many of you. And that's a real honor. Thank you for that very kind introduction, Tatiana. And so let me introduce, without further ado, the centerpiece, the starting point for my talk, which was a book that was published already now about 4 years ago, called The Wheel of Fortune. And I'm delighted to be here in Moscow, partly to celebrate the publication of the Russian language edition of the book. And so if you will allow me a little bit of samadvizhение, I will say that the Russian edition of the book has been completely updated. Hopefully some mistakes have been corrected. And at the same time, recent events such as the decline in oil prices and the sanctions, the impact of the sanctions, has also been included in the book. So this is, if not up to the minute, it is at least reasonably up to date. It's also, you'll be glad to learn, somewhat shorter than the original. So, and they did a very good job with the cover. This is Alpina Publishers, and they've done a number of books for us. Daniel Jurgen, in particular, has had the Russian editions of his books published by Alpina. So much for the reklama. Let me go into the book itself. It is based in part, Andrei, what a nice surprise. Very good. Indeed, indeed. It is partly a history book, and so that was my intention, to try to explain how we got to the present situation from a very different world. This is a world overturned and has become something completely different, something that could not have been imagined 25 years ago. And so this is an attempt to reconstruct how this happened. The metaphor of the Wheel of Fortune is really designed to capture this element of accident. Things so frequently could have turned out to be so different depending on the individuals involved. What if, for example, Mr. Bogdanov had not been able to close the airport in Surgut at the time of the privatization of Surgut Nefть? who would have ended up in control of Surgut, and so on and so on. So in so many ways, the wheel of fortune has determined who has survived, who has disappeared. Most of the oil generals have disappeared into retirement, some into the next world, and the ones who then have made it big and who remain on the scene today, was it a result of skill? Was it a result of luck? Was it a result of circumstance? Or was there some underlying rule of history, you might say, that has tended to determine who the winners were? So that was part of my intention. I was very fortunate not to be a participant. I am not a neftianik, I'm not a geolog, I'm none of those things. And in a way, I'm a chance observer. But the observation post that I had was a very fortunate one. I joined BP as a consultant and worked for John Brown, who was the CEO of BP. And so we were doing things like flying from London to Tumieng to meet with people who were completely new to the Western scene. Yuri Shafranik, for example. I remember having the job of introducing Yuri Shafranik to a whole garden party of British bankers in London. And at that time, he was unknown. He was still the head of the local parliament of the oblast. And so I took Yuri Shafranik around with me, and there would be these clusters of British bankers standing there with their glasses of champagne, and I would sort of intrude into the group, push them aside, and move Yuri Shafranik into the group of bankers and say, please, I would like you to meet the new governor of Tumieng Oblast. And they went on drinking their champagne. And then I said, I would like to introduce to you Yuri Shafranik, who controls 8 million barrels of oil in West Siberia. Oh, Mr. Shafranik, we are very glad to meet you. So those were the times when everything was new and everything was exciting, but two worlds were suddenly in contact. So having that opportunity to be able to meet people throughout this process was, I think, what I tried to put into the book. In the end, it's all about people, 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 and that's true in the oil industry as it is in everything else. So the key points that I want to make are these, that Russia came into the post-Soviet world with this extraordinary, unique legacy of conventional oil from West Siberia. If you look at the catalog of fields that still account for about 50% of Russian production, most of them began production as before 1991. So there's a tremendous legacy, and the story of the 25 years can be summed up as the very successful attempt to recover the potential of that legacy in conventional oil. And it has been a tremendous success story, as you'll see from the production numbers in just a moment. At the same time, there has been a revolution, more recent, in the world, not news to any of you here, but it is the revolution of unconventional oil coming from formations that were known were sometimes under production, but which were considered to be uneconomic with the technology of the day. And we'll talk about what the technology, the basis for the technology explosion is, but that has led in the last 10 years to something that is turning the world of oil upside down, and that is the revolution of unconventional oil, that is to say low porosity, low permeability formations that suddenly are economic to produce, and the result has been a revolution. The United States, back among the top producers in the world, no one could have imagined such a thing even as recently as 5 years ago. But the key point is that this revolution, this new revolution, is coming to Russia. It is perfectly within the potential of the Russian geology. The question is what is needed in Russia to make good on that potential. And finally, the big question out there is the Russian government, are the Russian companies ready for that challenge? And I would argue that at this moment, there's a lot of work to do, and the book tries to explain what some of those challenges are, particularly in a world in which yet another revolution is coming along, and that is the revolution of renewables, which is putting a ceiling on demand for hydrocarbons and liquid oil in particular. So that's basically the roadmap that I want to take you through. It begins in 1991. I'm going to go through this part very quickly because this is something that we have all lived through, and you know this story better than anyone. The abrupt decline in production that began after the peak in 1987, and then by the mid-1990s, the low point of disarray in the industry, the whole Soviet system of supply for services. Remember how much of the service industry was concentrated in Azerbaijan? Remember how bad that equipment is? I hope I'm not offending anybody from Azerbaijan here. But the West Siberian oil industry had entire предприятия that were devoted to the repair of the equipment that would arrive from Azerbaijan, and it had to be fixed. Even though it was new, it had to be fixed before it could be taken out into the fields. But then, of course, when Azerbaijan became independent, then that lifeline was broken. So that's an example of the kind of anarchy that broke out in the oil fields, quite apart from the political turmoil that was taking place at the time. And so the all-out war then for oil, for revenues, for property, for licenses, for production, for influence. The local criminals were involved in Tumin. There were illegal flows of oil. There was everything. And so no point in going back on that system except that what people lost sight of at the time was that the influence of the state, the regulatory system, never entirely disappeared. It went dormant, it went inactive. But the fact is that it remained in place. And this helps to explain something that was baffling to foreigners and baffling to Western companies, and that was how quickly central control was reestablished once central authority, once political authority was reestablished. So if you run the movie to about 2005, you get to the point where that regulatory authority, the physical control over key resources, and in particular the pipelines. It's very interesting to conduct a thought experiment. Mr. Chernyaev, who was the head of Transneft, and who was really an engineer's engineer, he was actually Chernyaev Jr. His father had been one of the founders of the Soviet pipeline system in his day, at the second Baku. And Chernyaev was the man who built the pipeline system for the third Baku, you might say, for West Siberia. What if Chernyaev, by personality, had been a John D. Rockefeller? What if he had been an empire builder? What if he had had the kind of personality to attempt to use the pipeline system as the basis for building an empire? Well, we'll never know, because Chernyaev was not Rockefeller. He was only interested in running his pipelines. And so very quickly he made himself a common carrier. He went to Alaska to find out how to become a common carrier. And he took himself out of the line of conflict, took himself out of the line of fire. At least this is the story that he told me, and I believe him, because as I sat and talked with him, I had the impression that this was a man who, above all in life, loved his pipelines, wanted his pipelines to work, and was not particularly interested in building an empire. Be interested to hear your thoughts if you had a different experience of Chernyaev. So then we see, again, a story that is very familiar, the stabilization of production that took place. Remember that we're talking here about a time of of relatively low oil prices. And yet in 1998, we have yet another crisis as oil prices fall even further. And that brought on a new period of challenge and testing, not only for the oil industry, but for the Russian economy as a whole. You remember the 3-month treasury notes that the Russian government was issuing in those days. The phenomenal mountain of debt, and all of that collapsed in what was then the second crash of the Soviet economy, the first one having been in the late 80s, then the second one in 1998. And yet in 1999, oil prices turned around, and on the back of that, Russian oil production started to increase. What was going on there? Because that marked the beginning of a movement that continued until about 2007 or so, of very rapid increase. In fact, during that period of time, from 2000 to 2006, Russia contributed half of the net growth in oil production for the entire world. And this recovery was largely based on the existing fields of West Siberia. Well, at this point, I introduce a character who's practically now becoming mythical. And he is, as he sinks into history, we can consider him as a historical figure and start thinking to ourselves, all right, what was the man's contribution in more objective terms, whatever one's opinion might have been about him as a personality? What was his objective contribution to this whole process of the recovery of the Russian oil industry? Well, as we know, the result of the Yukos affair, the final result of the Yukos affair, was the absorption of Yukos by Rosneft. What we have perhaps tended to forget is how this transformed the whole profile of Rosneft. And go back in history to 1998. In 1998, on the eve of the crash, there was a privatization auction for Rosneft that was held not once, but 3 times. 3 times the government tried to auction off Rosneft to private holders. Each time the auction failed because nobody wanted Rosneft, because it was considered that its potential was so unpromising that it was not worth spending serious money on. It was the leftover lifeboats from whatever had not been claimed by the emerging oligarchs. And as a result, it was just such a collection of problems that nobody wanted to have anything to do with it. And behind that, I think, is a very interesting theme, which I try to bring out in the book, and that is that throughout the 1990s, if you asked people in the government, do you want a national oil company? The answer was always a kind of a shrug. Why would we want a national oil company? What's a national oil company? What do you do with it? What good is it? Or I love that Russian expression, с каким соусом надо его есть? And that was precisely the kind of reaction that you would get. What do you need a national oil company for? Well, that question was still very much in the minds of people when Rosneft absorbed Lugansk and absorbed the main producing assets of Yukos. And here I want to resurrect another historical figure. Again, very quickly, time passes and these people become history. And no one talks about Bogdanchikov anymore, who was, after all, the head of Rosneft for about 10 years. I think Bogdanchikov's contribution to history can be summarized under 2 heads. One is that he, well, 3. One is that he managed to take Rosneft, this collection of lifeboats, plus the Lugansk asset, and he actually managed to make it work. If you ask who was it who, in fact, succeeded in developing Vankor, for example, it was Bogdanchikov. And he deserves that credit today, even though he's mostly forgotten. The other thing that is fascinating about Bogdanchikov is that of all of the various Neftyaniki, he was the only one who actually had hands-on experience doing a joint venture with a major oil company. He was a man who actually knew ExxonMobil from the inside because he had worked with ExxonMobil at Sakhalin for a number of years. Sakhalin Morneftegaz did the first horizontal well by a Russian oil company in Sakhalin together with Exxon, with Exxon at that time. Rex Tillerson, Bogdanchikov had worked with Rex Tillerson. In those days, Rex Tillerson was in charge of international business development for Exxon, traveled to Russia frequently, and was directly responsible for putting together the joint venture in Sakhalin. This then has consequences as Rosneft and Exxon start negotiating their strategic agreement many years later. No longer with Bogdanchikov there. This time Bogdanchikov is gone, but by this time you get a handful of people. If you ask around, there's a handful of people who actually are the veterans of Sakhalin and who have had hands-on experience of that partnership. These are two companies that know each other pretty well. Well, then Bogdanchikov came to Moscow. The rest is history. But I think he made a third contribution to history, and that is that involuntarily he prepared the way for Igor Sitchin. And this is a bit of history that is, of course, still with us, and yet it is possibly the single most important development of the last 20 years. It is the direct consequence of the Yukos affair, but it puts in place someone who has been in proximity to Vladimir Putin's office ever since the days, before the days when Vladimir Putin was the de facto mayor of St. Petersburg. In fact, the story as I understand it, I think this was narrated in Putin's authorized biography called First Person. There was a goodwill tour of Brazil. Correct me if you've heard a different version of this. On a goodwill tour of Brazil, to which were invited various officials of city governments, including the then deputy mayor of St. Petersburg, Vladimir Putin, in the delegation there was a guide who was responsible for taking the Russian visitors around. He was someone who had studied Portuguese as a student and had made his early career as an interpreter. Consequently, he was the resource person. He apparently did such a good job taking the Russian delegation around Rio de Janeiro and Sao Paulo and other places in Brazil that Putin said to him, you know, you do a pretty good job. Come and see me if you ever need work. Come and see me in my office. And when the delegation returned to St. Petersburg, then Sechin went to see Putin, and the rest is history. I don't know if this is true or not, but it makes a very nice story. In any case, that too was a fateful, circumstance, an accident. What if Sechin had not been in Rio de Janeiro? What if there had been no delegation to Brazil? The accidents of history, the wheel of fortune. Now, that really concludes the historical, the fast gallop through the history, which is well known to all of you. What I want to try to do then is to turn this 25 years of experience into 5 challenge questions for the Russian oil industry. And I hope we then have time for a discussion to go into each of these, or the ones that will be of greatest interest to you. The first is the prospect of a drop in production. And although at this moment, Russian oil production has been increasing remarkably, that's quite a story in itself. Nevertheless, the question is what happens after about 2020 or so, when the potential of the West Siberian conventional production continues to decline and the contribution of, say, the Vankor group plateaus. And there is only a limited contribution from the rest of East Siberia. Vankor, as all of you know, is in fact not in East Siberia at all, even though it is administratively in East Siberia. Geologically, it is the northeasternmost extension of the West Siberian sedimentary rock. So it is in fact part of the West Siberian story. So a decline in production after 2015, well, obviously this is not something that happened. We at the time were skeptical that there would actually be a decline after 2015. There was a consensus in the world that there would be, and that Russian oil production was fragile. And that I will remind you, this was before the actual decline in oil prices. But the general logic for pessimism on the part of analysts is basically this, that as you move out from the sweet spot of West Siberia, you are basically going into conditions that are all of the things that you see here: colder, deeper, farther, more sour, et cetera, et cetera. And the implication of that is higher cost. You can apply technology, and technology will offset some of those higher cost trends, and yet you're moving out of one of God's greatest gifts, the West Siberian basin, and you're moving into areas that are simply less prospective, even though the resource may be very abundant. East Siberia, you have to explain to people in the West. You people know, but you have to explain to people in America that East Siberia, just because it's next door to West Siberia, is not the same thing. That there is this huge volcanic shield over much of East Siberia, and that consequently the fields that we know about are ones that are essentially hot spots in a province whose geology to this day has not been fully explored yet. Someday it will be, and who knows? East Siberia may reveal its true potential, but it has not given up its secrets yet. And so to produce in East Siberia, you have to deal with cold and distance and less prolific geology. And that's an illustration. And so the formula is quite simple. Russia is not running out of oil. Russia will never run out of oil, even if there is not an unconventional revolution in Russia. Even if it remains conventional, Russia will never run out of conventional oil. But what is happening is that it is running short of cheap oil, and that makes all the difference. This can be portrayed, and this is a slide that we used for our clients in about 2015 in my IHS consulting work. If you look at this red line, this is basically the line of year in, year out decline in existing fields. And then in order to race uphill against that decline, you have to add these successive layers of new fields and hope that at the end of the day, you will have a margin which is your net increase. Well, Russia won that bet and won it handsomely, partly by delaying this line here, the projected line of decline, and bringing it down somewhat, and also doing a very successful job of developing those new fields. And as a result, after 2015, production continued to increase. But then came the price crash in 2014 with a direct impact on the Russian oil industry in 2015 and the years afterward. What was the impact of the price crash? The result, of course, was an immediate hit to the cash flow of the Russian oil companies in dollars. And in a sense, you had a reproduction in 2014-15 of the situation of 1998 with a massive devaluation of the ruble. The devaluation has a stimulative effect on the oil industry because it stimulates you get your revenues in dollars, but at the same time, 80 to 90% of your costs in the Russian oil industry are paid for in rubles. And consequently, you benefit from a devaluation dividend, as they called it in the late 1990s. It wasn't nearly as strong in 2014-15, but nevertheless, it was very important. Look at the consequences for the composition of capital investment by the oil companies. In rubles, there was no decline in capital investment. In dollars, there was, but there was no decline in rubles, and the Russian oil companies were able to continue operating. Perhaps not as much as before in the high technology end of things, which, as we'll see in a moment, continues to rest on imported technology. But for ordinary operations, conventional drilling, it was possible to keep right on going because most of that was based on ruble costs. By the way, these slides can be made available to the audience, so you don't have to photograph them. You can have a look at them, and I hope then that you will criticize them as well. You have to criticize them and give some response as well and tell us where we went wrong. The second challenge, the declining oil revenue to the state budget. This is the point that I think Western analysts have tended to leave out of account. And that is that in the wake of the decline in oil prices, in the wake of the sanctions, which I'll come to in a moment, in the wake of these negative headwinds, the oil companies have actually done pretty well. The people who have taken the hit are in the government. And that is because of the structure of the Russian tax system. The Russian tax system could be compared to a mountain with a very steep slope. So long as world oil prices are going up, the Russian government takes most of the marginal revenues. Consequently, higher oil prices benefit very largely the Russian government. But guess what? If there is a decline in oil prices or a crash in oil prices, that same slope then acts and takes most of the hit against the government, not against the Russian oil companies. The lower oil prices went, the lower the percentage that the government was able to take, and the higher percentage that the Russian oil companies were able to keep. This is one of the reasons why the cash flow of the oil companies remained on the whole as healthy as it was. If you combine the effect of the tax slope plus the devaluation, you have a large part of the explanation for why the crisis was not so severe for the oil companies, as it has been, however, for the government. But I want to look beyond the immediate crisis to talk about something more fundamental, about the division of rents between the industry and the government. We're talking about a state that relies over 50% for its revenues from the income from oil and gas. Now, what's going to happen as costs go up? Remember what I was saying when I showed you the map: deeper, colder, farther away, and so on. The cost structure goes up. As the cost structure goes up, the margin decreases of profitability, and the battle for the division of rents between the state and the industries becomes more and more intense. This is simply built into the nature of a finite natural resource. It's true all over the world. It is true in Russia. It is going to be increasingly true of Russia as the battle for the division of rents becomes ever more intense. The industry is going to need those revenues if it is going to remain competitive, and yet the government cannot afford to give them up. That is the nature of the conflict between these two opposing interests. I'm going quickly over complex issues, and so I hope that you will bring me back to them as we go into discussion, but I want to move on to the impact of sanctions, which I haven't mentioned at all up until now. Now, I live in Washington, so I have made it my business to try to understand a little bit more about how the sanctions machinery works and how it was constructed in the first place. It is very easy to criticize the sanctions, and I am personally critical of the sanctions. I think it is important to try to arrive at some agreement so that the sanctions can be lifted. I think it's very harmful for Russian-American relations. At the same time, given the situation as it was in 2014, if you put yourself in your imagination in the president's chair in the White House, I think you can imagine very easily that President Obama had to do something. He had to do something in response to what he considered to be a foreign policy challenge in Ukraine and Crimea. If he had done nothing, he would have been murdered politically by the sharks in Washington and by public opinion and by the press. He had to do something. Now, he couldn't send tanks. He didn't want to send tanks. Besides, where are you going to send tanks? Okay. So he didn't send tanks. He didn't, in fact, agree to those in Congress who wanted to send offensive weapons into Ukraine. Slava Bogu. That didn't happen then. So what happened instead was that he reached for the one thing that American policy reaches for when it doesn't know what to do: sanctions. Okay, so that's how that originated. But they didn't simply reach from a drawer for something ready-made. I've talked to a number of the people who tried to put these sanctions together, and the idea was this: we don't want to punish Russia. We want to punish certain specific individuals in Russia whom we hold responsible for the things that have happened that we don't like. Consequently, we're going to design sanctions in such a way that they are targeted. They're targeted at the financial sector, at the handful of banks and companies that we consider to be most closely associated with the Kremlin, and we are going to target not Russian oil production as a whole, but rather the future oil production of Russia. And that way, we are not trying to cause a crisis in the Russian economy, but we're trying to send a message. That, at least, was the intention of the people who drafted the sanctions. Now, what happened? The impact of the financial sanctions turned out to be devastating in the first year or two. And the result was a major, major addition to the economic crisis in Russia. I've talked to the people who created these sanctions, and I've asked them, were you surprised? Yes, we were surprised. We didn't realize that the impact of the financial sanctions was going to be as great as it was. But I'm going to push that aside and focus for just a moment on the impact of the sanctions on the oil industry specifically. Remember what I said, that the intention was not to stop Russian oil production, but rather to pinpoint two very specific items. The first was tight oil, that is unconventional oil, shale oil. It's written in the language of the sanctions, if you look at it, that the Western companies are forbidden to export technology that contributes to the development of shale oil, specifically shale oil. Now, that does leave, in fact, a large gray zone of what you might call tight oil, which is still okay. And the Western service companies are still, in fact, actively involved in working with Russian companies in the development of tight oil. That is to say, low porosity, low permeability, but not shale. The Bazhenov is a no-no, but the rest is okay, is broadly a simple way to think about it. Offshore oil and gas development was targeted. And the idea was simply this. We know that Russia is not producing oil from the deep Arctic offshore today, but it will tomorrow. And consequently, the message that we want to send is you will not be able to develop the offshore if you continue the foreign policy that we don't like. Okay, I don't want to get into the question of foreign policy because that's not what today's talk is about. But I just want to make the point that there was a specific strategy behind those sanctions. Now, the question is, what has been the impact? Well, first of all, with the new administration that's come in, everything that you have read is true. And consequently, the difficulty with dealing is that we have a man who is extremely inexperienced in all manner of foreign policy, a man who does not know his own mind, and a man who changes his mind seemingly every day. And there's no point in trying to conceal what is, in fact, at this moment, an extremely worrisome policy situation. Now, what are the consequences for sanctions? It was originally thought, and by me, people like me, it was originally hoped that it would be easy to roll back the sanctions, and indeed there was a great deal of discussion of that long about November, December of last year. Why? After all, in Washington, nothing is easy, it seems. Why did we imagine that this would be easy? Well, for one reason. The sanctions are not in U.S. law. They are not laws passed by the Congress and signed by the President. They are executive orders, as we call them. That is to say, they are orders put out by the President without Congress and without signature into law. Consequently, the President can look at the executive order and say, oh, right, it's canceled. End of story. In other words, the executive orders could be canceled in 1 minute. So why hasn't it happened? Well, because Russia became an issue. Russia became a source of controversy. Russia became a source of scandal because of all of the question marks concerning the election and the question of what role Russian interests might have played in the election campaign. And all of this has led to scandals and charges, and you would not believe the experience of watching television in the United States these days. It is 24/7, 24 hours, 7 days a week, Russia, 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 Russia. I ask you, is this any basis for international relations? I don't know how long this is going to go on, but at the moment it's madness. And the result of that madness is that there is going to be no action on an early rollback of sanctions. In principle, it is easy to do. The sanctions are executive orders, as I've explained. The problem is simply the state of disorder in American policy at this moment, and no one knows here, there, or anywhere else what the course and the outcome are going to be. The main danger, however, the main danger is that these executive orders could become acts of law, and that could happen in coming weeks, because in Congress there is strong sentiment for toughening those sanctions by passing laws which then the White House would either have to decide to sign or veto. But if the President were to sign those laws, then they become part of the fixed legal structure of the country, and they are very difficult to undo at that point. Congress would have to undo legislation, and the sentiment in Congress is, on the whole, not friendly toward Russia. Consequently, laws on sanctions, if they get passed, would stay there for who knows how long. And that is, I think, the danger that people, observers in Washington, are most concerned about. Now, in Congress, some people say that is precisely what we should be doing. Okay, that's the shape of the debate. Now you're up to the minute in what's going on. I want to go from there to talk about the favorite subject of conversation of the Western oil companies during these 25 years. During those 25 years, it was certainly hoped by the Western oil companies that they could come in, they could take over major companies, that they could establish operating control, that they could establish financial control, that they would be able to capitalize on the remaining potential of conventional oil and also new oil areas such as Sakhalin. They were full of hope. In the end, as you see, very little happened, and the contribution of the Western oil companies was indirect rather than direct. Perhaps 5% of Russian oil production directly traceable to the active, hands-on participation of Western oil companies. The moral of the story is that the Russians were #1 in the world in 1987. When the Western oil companies came in, the Russian oil men basically said, "Чем вы хуже вас?" And the consequence was that control was never surrendered, except in one instance, and that was the TNK-BP joint venture. And that's why the TNK-BP joint venture is certainly worth studying carefully as an example of what happens when you get a technology transfer that extends to financial control and operational control. One person who thought that the experiment was very positive was Sergei Bogdanchikov, because what he did then when he took over Lugansk was to take the management structure of Lugansk and move a large part of it right into the decision-making structures of Rosneft. That, you might say, was the ultimate complement to the kind of true hybridization, true integration that took place in TNK-BP. So for those of you who are historians, my advice would be look very closely at the experience of TNK-BP to see what actually happened and then how much of it then turned out to be relevant for Rosneft subsequently. The reason this question, however, has come back to us is that the entire offshore and much of the unconventional potential was on the verge of becoming the subject of a new chapter of partnership with the Western companies. That has largely been either dramatically slowed down or stopped altogether. And I think this is ultimately the greatest challenge now that the Russian nefteniki have learned how to work with the US and the other Western oil companies. Then this would be the moment when you would get some real synergies from partnership, and yet this has been interrupted by the sanctions. It's been interrupted by political events. I don't know whether this story will be resumed, and if so, how soon. Meanwhile, then, the Russian oil companies are attempting to go forward into the offshore. One that is particular interest is Centralna Olginskaya. I hope I'm putting the pronunciation right. And it is interesting because most of the contractors are actually Russian. This is a coming out exercise for some of the service industry, but at the same time there are some subcontractors, Halliburton and Weatherford. The reason that they're able to work there is that technically this is not deep water offshore. This is, in other words, allowable under the sanctions, and we'll see if it in fact remains allowable. In the areas of high technology, there is a very active policy by the Russian government to displace, to encourage local substitution, zamещение of Western technology by domestic production. This is a policy which will pay rich dividends, and in that sense, the sanctions may ultimately turn out to be beneficial for Russia, actually, rather than harmful. But that involves taking a very long-term view of the situation. As you see here, the market for high-tech, at any rate, at the high-tech end of the spectrum, is still very much dominated by foreign suppliers. One problem the service companies will tell you is not so much the difficulty of coming up with good Russian equipment and technology. It is the lack of interest by the oil companies themselves in taking the risk of using Russian contractors for high technology operations. And so there is a problem of not supply, but of demand on the part of the integrated Russian companies. Maybe there should be a little more bravery. At the same time, of course, times have been difficult. Oil prices are low. Can one afford to take chances? I'd like to say a couple of words about the tight oil revolution in the United States. And the question is, to what extent is it transferable to Russia? In principle, it certainly should be. First of all, the immense scale of what we're talking about here, this amazes Americans. This graphic is already far out of date, and yet the revolution continues to roll in the United States. It is a second oil era for America. But here's the thing. What has been responsible for this explosion of production? It's not just about shale oil to begin with. It's that far wider group of opportunities that we call tight oil. And the revolution is not below ground. It's above the ground. It is, in particular, the structure of the industry. And I'll just summarize what I heard from the CEO of a company that was working here called Ruspetro, who had some licenses in West Siberia. And he was saying, look, let's say that I want to get a frac truck from, let's say that I want to get a frac truck from Dallas to Midland, Texas. He says, I can call up in the morning, I can lease that truck in the morning, I can have it on its way to Midland, Texas, and it will be there by evening, and it will be at work by the next morning. He said, what takes 24 hours in Texas will take about 6 weeks in West Siberia. First of all, because of the quality of the roads, but that's another matter, but also getting the permits, getting the permissions of all kinds to be able to cross administrative barriers, to go through security. And he said to grease the right palms under the table. And he said the result of that is just a tremendous inefficiency that is fatal for the small operator. And yet the story of tight oil in the United States is above all the story of the success of the small operators. In a place like the Permian Basin, you have 11,000 companies that are all competing with one another for the development of that region. It is it's a jungle. It's a jungle. It's wild capitalism in action. But nevertheless, it is because those companies are all working on individual plays, trying to come up with the right formula, taking risks, being willing to fail, going bankrupt if they go bankrupt, and yet the results speak for themselves. The question is it necessary to have that same kind of environment in Russia in order to get the tight oil revolution really going in a place such as West Siberia or the Volga-Urals basin? That's a wide open question, but it is also one that is not encouraging because those independents exist. Although they exist in Russia, they exist in far smaller numbers, and they are not nearly so entrepreneurial as their cousins in Texas and Oklahoma and in the Dakotas. What is the tight oil revolution? It's basically a combination of 3 technologies. All of them, in one way or another, were invented or at least experimented with in Russia. And consequently, we're talking about simultaneous invention. The first fracking in the United States was a gas frack that took place in Missouri in the 1940s. This was about the same time that Russian oil men were experimenting with fracking in the Volga-Urals. But nevertheless, the technique of fracturing, which has then become far more sophisticated, instead of one frack job in a single well, you have multiple fracks. Now you have 30 fracturing operations taking place within one horizontal well. Then the whole phenomenon of horizontal drilling. And all of this, remember, can be directed by 3D seismic mapping. You can have an operator sitting anywhere in the world and actually controlling the direction of that drill bit by remote control using 3D mapping to determine where the sweet spots are, directing the drill bit into the sweet spot, and then since that sweet spot is very frequently a lens of oil that goes horizontally, then you direct the drill bit right through that sweet spot, and you get tremendous production because you're fracking along the whole way. Those 3 things together have to be mixed together in different combinations with different variations. And since I'm not a technical oil man, I can't give you the details, but what I'm told again and again is that this is something that the small operators are able to do and the big oil companies are not able to, at least not with the same degree of flexibility, the same degree of innovativeness, and above all, the same degree of risk-taking. That's crucial. And so if one talks about reforms that are important for the future of the Russian oil industry, I would put that as number 1. Yes, the taxes are important. Yes, the issues are important involving politics. Yes, yes, yes. But the main thing is, where are the independents who have been responsible for the tight oil revolution? And lastly, I'm just going to mention, and there are no pictures that I can give you, but it's what we are all reading, except I'll bring you the view from the United States, which is the tremendous rolling impact of renewables. What's happening with renewables is that solar and wind have come of age. The costs are dropping like stones. The innovation that's taking place is phenomenal. We are seeing now the missing piece of the puzzle being put into place, namely battery technology, so that you can get storage of renewable energy. There's going to be then a massive transformation of the entire electrical power sector of the United States as it moves massively to electricity from renewables. And the result of that is going to be electricity available for electrical cars. We're talking about electrification of transportation. Now, what is the one remaining sector where oil remains the king? It is transportation. And what is the one place where, above all, the battle is being fought? It's for the North American passenger car owner. Electric cars are sweeping the country. It is absolutely extraordinary. And I think we're going to see over the just 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, we're going to see that momentum continuing to build. Now this raises, of course, the most fundamental question of all. There's an old joke that says the Stone Age didn't end because human beings ran out of stones. Well, and then the version of that is the oil age is not going to end because human beings will run out of oil. But what is the right strategy then if you take this seriously? And this actually has some very current issues behind it. Should Russia, in fact, be going along with OPEC in limiting production? Wouldn't it be, in fact, a lot smarter and more strategic to monetize that oil now and to get the benefit for it now, rather than attempt to hold it into the ground when maybe its value will not be as great tomorrow? Especially, of course, if you bear in mind that money tomorrow is worth less than money today. So take the money today, take the money and run. And maybe that is, in fact, the smartest future, and use it for technological development for the broader, the broader spectrum of Russian industry and technology. But on that note, I will close, and thank you very much for your attention.
Tейн, one question which is becoming our tradition, and it is, if you were invited to Vladimir Vladimirovich to give an advice, what should Russia do in order to ensure sustainable future development of its oil and gas sector, taking into account this beautiful graph that you draw on shrinking rent, yeah, with increasing competition to share it between the companies and the state, and all these challenges with the new resources, with the new provinces, with sanctions, with very uncertain demand for oil, and strong competition on the gas market. So what do you think would be one most efficient, most urgent step to do?
Well, my answer will strike you as very naive, but you will sense the direction that I'm trying to go in. Make Alexei Kudrin Prime Minister and give him full powers.
I see. Well, just a week ago, we had him here in the next room presenting his strategy, his economic strategy, and speaking about not only digitalization of everything, but also about competition and small business, also including the oil sector and many other nice things. So, yeah, sounds like a good idea. If you have any? Okay, they're kind. So, Tейн, thank you so much for making this way to our village and giving this wonderful presentation. I really enjoyed, and your Q&A session, I think there were, well, quite tricky questions, frankly speaking. And I would ask everybody to join me in thanking Tейн. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
And for you not to forget this evening in Skолково, this is a small present.
Thank you.
Also made, it's Russian-style suprematism.
Marvelous.
Yeah, so it's Matryoshka in Malevich
In
style.
Malevich style, that's marvelous. Thank you so much. Thank you.
So, and as you kindly permitted, we will put your presentation and it will be available on our website, and we will also put it on Facebook and so on. And there will be a video of this speech and also available, so please follow. And the next our event will be June 26th, and it will be Jonathan Elkant coming here. So this is the man who was working at the US Department of Energy Information Administration, responsible for the climate negotiations and for all the international affairs. So I think we will keep talking about Trump.
He's good value. He's very good.
He is fantastic.
Good friend of mine.
Mark in your calendar, June 26th.
Very
and
good.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thanks.
Thank you.